Hello, everybody. My name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I am sorry I can't be with you at the conference today. I am recording this video from Canada. I've been asked to do a presentation about the Heads Up tool. But before we talk a little bit about the tool, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of work that I do so that you know where I'm coming from. So, one of the narratives that I use to talk about what I do is to say that my work is concerned with humanity's capacity and lack of capacity to figure out how to get out of a mess it has created, a mess that jeopardizes its own survival. And in this work, we ground it in my group of researchers grounded in the assumption that this is not fundamentally a problem of knowing that can be fixed with more information, but a problem of a habit of being, how we relate to the world. So we believe that the ways that we relate to the world are the grounding force for how we think about it, not the other way around. So we talk about restrictive, cognitive, affective, and relational contextual wirings, neurobiological wirings that affect our neurobiology and our functionality in this planet. So the idea here is that we need to change the motherboard, not just the apps of our system. And I'm concerned about trying to find how to engender a form of responsibility that is not an intellectual choice based on values or a decision that is dependent on will, based on what is convenient or something coercive, but a visceral precognitive imperative. We need to relate to the world through our whole bodies before we commit to taking care of the world and of each other. So, why I don't think that values can ground this is that in this day and age, we have a proliferation of values. There are values everywhere, and people consume values. They change values as they change clothes sometimes. And so the values do not necessarily today compel people. To act sometimes it's just something that they have as part of their self-image, but it doesn't mean that they act on it. The same thing with will, like will we allocate when we can. Now I believe that responsibility needs to be something that is much more visceral, it's much deeper than that, and I'm looking for a kind of education that can do that. So through my research, I ask a few questions. So, for example, why is it that we as a human species are choosing to wreck the planet we depend upon for survival? Why do we choose more often than not the path that leads us to demean, exploit, enslave, hurt, and kill other species, and in times of instability, our own? Why do we choose to build nations and empires on the broken backs of our relatives? Why is it that we don't want to hear about our complicity in harm? Why is it that we prefer to hear about things that make us feel good or hopeful, that we can still keep our comforts when we know this is unsustainable? Why aren't we asking more difficult questions? Why don't we have the stamina to dig deeper? And I don't think these are necessarily moral problems. Sometimes they are problems related to our affective engagements and how historically, systemically, and culturally we are made to want certain things and not others. And we need to look at that. And the fourth question, why do our questions and solutions keep reproducing the same ways of knowing and being that created the problems in the first place? What educational processes have the potential to override this neurobiological wiring, our fears, our self-interest, our narratives, our ego, our narcissistic tendencies, our traumas, activate a visceral sense of entanglement, responsibility, humility, generosity, compassion, and openness that is not dependent on will or intellectual choices, and open up possibilities or worlds that are viable but unimaginable or inarticulable within our current frames of reference and desire. So basically, what possibilities would be open if our thinking and our action were not driven by our systemic fears, by our insecurities, by our traumas, by our attachments, and our destructive desires. So this is my disclosure. This is what I'm working on with my research team and with the NGOs that I work with and the artists that I work with and activists as well. And it's important, I think, for people to know that's where we're coming from as they approach the tools that we create in this process. So one of the tools that we have is related to this trained imaginary that we have in terms of how our imagination is geared to imagine in certain ways. So we generally ask people to imagine a field of corn um, and to harvest the corn very quickly, take the husks of the corn out, and put the harvest in front of them. And we ask them to compare to this picture of corn cobs here that are multicolored. These are corn cobs from Peru. And there is actually a reason, a political, agricultural reason why most people imagine yellow corn cobs, right? But we use this as a metaphor for how our imagination has been colonized. We can't imagine corn cobs of other colors now because we have been overexposed to the yellow corn cob. So we use the yellow corn cob as a metaphor for how we think about and imagine the many different things and how we are made to want these things as the norm, right? So we talk about a single story of progress, development, and human evolution that says that for people to be civilized or modern, they have to look like the yellow corn cob. So that affects how we think about education, about clothing, about justice, about relationships, about religion, about organization, about nation state, about security, about everything, health as well. So the question then is, if we are so attached and enchanted by the yellow corn cob, what are the implications in relation to the other corn cobs? So my work has been engaged in analysis of textbooks, the media, and teacher narratives, student narratives, in NGOs as well, how discourses are mobilized. In these hierarchies, there are certain social hierarchies that come up over and over again, saying that the yellow corn cob is usually associated with intelligence, benevolence, deservedness, cleanness, capacity, and leadership, while the other corn cobs are perceived in terms of lack, inadequacy, ignorance, violence, helplessness, servitude, and waste. And there are countless examples. Like, this is the water we swim in, that we embody the social relationships, social hierarchies in ways that we are conscious sometimes of it, but also in unconscious ways. So it's not just a problem of thinking. It's much deeper than that. So we have developed this tool called Heads Up to be able to identify intellectually what are the patterns of creating the social hierarchies. And the first one, it's an acronym. It becomes heads up at the end. But the first pattern is that when we're trying to engage from the yellow corn cob to the multicolored corn cobs, that form of engagement, when we want to help others, for example, that are marginalized or disenfranchised by society, without self-reflection, without deep self-reflection, these engagements and representations tend to be hegemonic. They reinforce and justify the status quo. They tend to be ethnocentric. They project one view as universal. They tend to be ahistorical. They forget historical legacies and complicities, how we are all interconnected through history, and how this history is often very violent. They are depoliticized. They disregard power inequalities and ideologies. So we don't understand the political economies that characterize our relationships. The fact that, for example, for us to have everything that we have, it comes from somewhere. And generally, the relations of production of these things and labor involved are violent and destructive. Not only in relation to humans, but also in relation to the environment. So when I say political here, is to understand the costs and the relationships that construct the kinds of consumer culture and individualistic and metropolitan cultures we all tend to aspire for. And S stands for salvationist or self-serving. So it's invested in heroic protagonism. So there is a problem in motivating people to try to make a difference for others, because it's a fine line until it becomes not about this connection that we have with others, but something that is about the person, about the brand of the person, and about a Facebook photo. And this has also been criticized a lot. In different countries, it's different. So some countries are more sensitive to this than others. But in Canada, this has been widely criticized, how we engage in these activities, or sometimes we take schools, for example, to certain countries in Africa to build a school there. It's not about really the people. It is more about feeling good, looking good, and creating a very good Facebook profile. So it becomes a self-congratulatory exercise, and we need to look into that. Then there is uncomplicated, offering just feel good quick fixes without looking at systemic issues that create poverty, that create inequalities, just trying to put a band aid on something so that we feel hopeful that this can be solved without looking at the more difficult things where the whole pedagogical process creates much more discomfort. And paternalistic, like that's infantilizing the other people and waiting for a thank you at the end of the process. And when then people are not thankful, then it becomes a problem, and sometimes they're called ungrateful, and then it all explodes again, revealing the hierarchies, right? That are underlying that big imaginary of the yellow corn cup. So a word of caution about the list. This is not something that you can say, okay, I'm not being hegemonic now or ethnocentric, ahistoric. I'll just stop doing all these things. It doesn't work like that. Because if you stop doing all of these things as an organization, you probably would become unintelligible to the wider, the water, right, that we swim on, to the wider public. So it's very difficult to break these patterns, not only because they are not just intellectual, they are also affective, but because of the question of intelligibility. If everybody believes in this single story of progress, development, and human evolution, if you're questioning that, generally people are going to resist it, and then your campaign or your educational initiative may not be as effective. So there's that problem that we have to be always negotiating with what's possible in the context, what's possible to challenge. But the other thing about it too is that sometimes when we want to solve a problem, it's actually happens very often, we create another one. So for example, if you try not to be hegemonic or try to challenge a hegemony, you tend to create another hegemony. Trying not to be hegemonic is also problematic, because then sometimes it becomes everything goes. That's the problem with challenging ethnocentrism and then saying, okay, so every answer is a good answer, right? So when contextually there are things that are more generative and less generative, right? When we challenge a historicism, there's also the tendency then to so there's one form of history that is being portrayed that is uncritical, and then we want to portray a critical form of history that also becomes another single story, right? So there's that problem, and trying to address depoliticization runs the risk of over politicizing things to the point that people can't hold the level of complexity and complicity that is involved in these relationships. So, and then also salvationism, we risk also interrupting opportunities for altruism and for real connection, the yearning for connection that people have with each other. So it's not easy and simple to actually interrupt these things. I think the tool is better used when it is just a tool for constant reflection, not something that takes you from A to B, but something that is going to bug you in a lifelong way, in a life-wide way, so that we can keep thinking about these things and experimenting and failing in trying to to change these patterns. And these failures are actually quite important because they help us to learn and to walk together very differently with more humility and more generosity in this process. So using this tool to say like, I know heads up and then I'm not doing these things anymore, it doesn't work because we do these things consciously or unconsciously. But being committed with your heart to uh, shifting these forms of relationship, knowing that it's not going to be one person that's going to do it. It's a long collective process that requires a lot of generosity and a lot of compassion and self-compassion too. That's I think what we're looking at and what it was created for. But you can use it in a way that is meaningful and relevant in your context. And if you want, you can let me know how it went. Thank you for the opportunity to present it, and I hope you have a wonderful conference.